Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, a publishing division of the Association of College and Research Libraries. This four-part series is brought to you with support from SAGE. These days, we find ourselves in a perfect storm of growing mistrust in science and a proliferation of misinformation. As we get past our incredulousness at this state of affairs, some of us are realizing that we need to turn the spotlight on the specialists who create, investigate, collect, and protect established scientific information. SAGE and Sense About Science, an organization that promotes the importance of science and scientific evidence to the general public, have released a report that pulls together those very same stakeholders, publishers, journalists, and librarians, to highlight the important roles these information curators play in today's information ecosystem. Joining the program to discuss the report called The People's Case for Curators and the Critical Importance of Curating Scientific Information for the Public Good are Tracy Brown, the Director of Sense About Science, Louis Coiffé-Gunn, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, and Camille Gamboa, Associate Vice President of Corporate Communications at SAGE. In this second episode of our series, we discuss key takeaways and action steps from the guide, The Power of Amplifying Scientific Evidence Through Journalists, Publishers, and Librarians, and how we can scale these messages to the general public. So let's move into some insights from the guide itself. I'm wondering if you both can outline some key takeaways. What do you think readers will find most useful and practical in their roles? And Camille, I'll pitch that to you first.
Sure. Yeah, so I think the most helpful thing that the guide does is to give science supporters and the entire scientific community, including curators themselves, a framework, a vocabulary to help us all easily explain how good science curation happens, so that, again, we can all build trust in science. And to do so, it highlights that there are humans doing this work, right? It really elevates the role of the curator, as we've been talking about. Expert, trained, experienced professionals. Journalists, as you were saying, don't always get the best rap for their work, but there are a class of journalists who are still, upholding these high standards, and they're much different than the public who just go about, taking on journalistic functions. And so we wanted to show that these people could be trusted, and I think we did. And along the way, I think we built evidence for values that serve the community well as well. So for example, curation that serves the public is about empowering and not gatekeeping. Curators don't hide behind self-serving algorithms. They don't tell people what to think. They provide diverse, credible information and critical thinking skills. And they enable independent inquiry. They uphold intellectual freedom, but it's really not just telling people this is the way it is. It's getting that critical thinking out there. And then another thing that I love the report does is that it indicates very clearly that when done well, this function is a public good. It's a public service. It enhances societal well-being. And I think that's the way we should think about it. I think that is the value that is deserved. So I think the report does a lot of things, but it's really a powerful communication tool that lists values that will serve society. And there are some direct calls to action so that people who read the report can be part of that action as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Tracy?
Yeah, I think in addition, I would say that for someone fairly new to the kind of information infrastructure, I think it's an interesting contrast that it makes between this sort of black box of how people are getting their information, algorithms and AI and so on, and the sort of scholarly approach. I think it highlights a lot of how that works. And will make people think about that. I would also say that transparency came through very strongly. And I think it's a very useful thing for people to see that When something's transparent, you can understand where information might go wrong, or you can understand that a study was limited in some way, and therefore a better study that comes along might find something slightly different or better or more insightful. And I think that process then is demystified. So through this, whilst we're talking about curators and their values and what they do, I think the process, the demystification of the process is good. I would say one thing that really surprised me was how strongly the curators went for explaining that they invite questioning. I was expecting people to talk about the way they validate and evaluate information, and that's covered in the guide. But the inviting of questioning, I thought that really took me aback. But it was certainly a really strong theme as they spoke together. And so we've celebrated that in the guide too, the fact of being open to people's questions, which again, in more polarized times where people tend to dig in and entrench, that I thought that really came through in a very refreshing way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess if someone has a question, you want them to be able to ask it because they want to feel like they need to trust, or they want to trust what they're reading or looking at. And if you prevent them from learning more about it, then they become more distrustful, I would suppose.
Exactly. That is a key part of trust. And I didn't really clock that until I heard it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Excellent. So we talked a little bit about, how well, as you were putting this guide together, how well like the editors and librarians and journalists kind of, blended in together as information curators. Um, I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on that a little bit and talk about sort of what unique strengths they all bring to the table and how, as a group, they sort of accelerate the messaging and mission of the guide.
Certainly, there's obviously key differences between them. So librarians really emphasize that their role is without judgment, that they make accessible pathways to different sources of information, and help people with the skills they need to use that. But they would really emphasize very strongly that they're not making judgments about the kind of things that people want to know, the things they want to read, the things they want to understand. And I thought that was quite strong from the librarians and distinct. The investigative journalists, who also, alongside some of the specialist journalists, were part of that discussion as well. Their emphasis was on selecting sources that help them to ask their questions. So they were sort of more about emphatic of the journey of a question. You take a question and you try and find the answer, and you appreciate the value of different sources in helping you to find that answer. So that was a slightly different judgment. And then editors brought to the table an understanding of criteria. So they select according to what is going to be valid, significant, original, key and important to their readership, and usually in a specialist area. And they, in doing so, have both a very specific kind of code in answering to their readership, but they also have a general code in terms of codes of conduct. So that began to get us thinking about those kinds of criteria, that there are codes of conduct, codes of practice, or just very open and accessible criteria by which they're making their decisions. So it doesn't mean that, the interests of, say, a journal are exactly the same as, a member of the public's interests. We're not suggesting that we've all got the same interests. It's simply that we can see how that selection is made and how it's benefiting a particular audience, and it's all open and transparent and can be judged accordingly. And so they're very different perspectives, but really similar values.
Excellent. Yeah, Camille?
Yeah, no, I agree with Tracy, and I would just add to that one way of looking at it is that it's getting the people to getting the right information to the people. And using an analogy, giving them the fish, but then also teaching them how to fish. So one one of the function that we found that a lot of them perform, at least to some extent, is again that like teaching them how to think critically and invite questioning and going through the process, and then also getting them that important information that's been vetted themselves. And I really liked that the way when Sense About Science approached us about this project, I liked that it was looking not just at the types of curation that we in academic publishing and maybe in academic librarianship as well think about, which is the curation that happens prior to publication, the editorial work, research integrity work, peer review, et cetera, et cetera. But I like that it took the next step. After publication, there's a bunch of work that happens that's really important and is still it's driven by codes of conduct and by standards to get information to the public as well. So again, librarians kind of do a little before and after. Before publication, and then after publication, they also do further vetting before information can get to their patrons. And then, of course, journalists, they do the great work of if they're doing their jobs well, they're doing their really important work of making sure that only the best information is making it to the public. So that kind of holistic take from, pre-publication to the public's consumption, I really liked because that's the reality that we're dealing with. That's the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so why don't we talk a little bit about the steps the guide shares for helping people amplify what public good curators do? What are some of those action steps, Tracy?
Well, the first thing is we want to make the invisible visible. And what we've pointed out is that everyone can play some role in that. One of the great advantages that we're all publishers now, we have our own social media accounts, is it's relatively easy to share our own reflections, to share, obviously we want people to share the guide. We want public good curators to do a lot of that. But we also want the wider public to do it. And we've invited people as well to share their own thoughts about how some of the groups described in the guide have helped them. I mean, we've included a few. We've already had, some feedback from people saying things like, well, my kids' curiosity was really encouraged at our local library. Or I remember when I was trying to understand how to set up a study, that this one librarian really helped me to find some obscure sources, of other people who've done similar things. And those types of stories and recollections really help to just make this part of our normal understanding, our conversation. The other thing I think is to make think of when we're communicating science. So those people who are involved in communicating science, including journals that are sending out press releases and so on, to remember to make mention of the process by which something is, to say, for example, it's a peer-reviewed paper or it's published in this journal, and to say that, to talk about the people involved in it, and also I think to sometimes to help one another. So I do think that we should all be thinking about when we read a report and we think, wow, that journalist has really done their homework. Say so. Because at half the time, I mean, we were talking at other points in this conversation about journalists. Sometimes a specialist journalist or an investigative journalist has had to have a big row to get a piece in, or to make sure that it's well grounded and the evidence is mentioned. And I think getting a note of congratulations rather than just the complaints when it's wrong helps to give more power to their elbow.
Right.
So there's that too. And we've also asked people to think about the conferences and events that they've got coming up and where this might sit on their agenda. Camille and I, have been sort of on the road, as it were, talking about this. We were at Charleston. We've been, telling anyone who'll listen about this guide and about the principles behind it. But there are so many others who can speak probably far more eloquently than me on this subject. And so please think about including those things in your plans and events.
Absolutely. I mean, scientific communication is kind of an art in itself. It's different than sort of, I don't know how you differentiate it, but there's a process to it. I mean, describing scientific results and that kind of thing to a general public it takes a special nuance that perhaps more mainstream content, doesn't need.
Well, there are so many experts in explaining uncertainty in this field because there are these things which, in a social context have a different meaning than it does in a scientific context. And so there's a lot of wisdom around actually in this area as well. And I think, this is the key thing about the curators that we talk to is what they understand the sources and they understand their audience. That's the thing. They have both sides. And both of those are essential. And I think we were talking about trust. I think they're essential to trust, knowing that, if you think when people go to a doctor, they expect their doctor or a clinician to understand the medical sources they're using, but also to understand us, to understand what our own medical history is, what our needs are. And I think that's where you see the foundations of trust.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think building on what we've just talked about, do you think it's possible, and I think you do, for the efforts of public good curators, in these professions that you highlight, to scale to match that of mainstream press and social media that you've mentioned already? Like, how do we get this messaging out of sort of our own circle of academia or the scientific community and into the broader public sphere?
Well, I'm optimistic about this.
Yeah.
10 years or so ago, Sense About Science undertook to increase public understanding around the world of peer review. And we got so many people involved in that campaign, from media to libraries to schools to parliaments. And here we are now, where I think, is it peer reviewed is quite a normal question to ask on a radio show. It certainly wasn't when we started. And so I am optimistic that we can increase understanding. We want it to become part of the mainstream, not an alternative to the mainstream, but we want to talk about the way we get our information, the sources that have been used, and how we've arrived at those, just to become mainstream.
Right.
And so that's the key thing, I think. And the first thing is to start getting it, to be something that those people who are invested already in the system could talk about. I think that we've kind of got to win the home crowd to the effort as much as possible and as quickly as possible as we do it. So I think, but also showing people who are involved in the information infrastructure that it's important for them to be seen is a key part.
Yeah, excellent. So can I ask you about what you just talked about with Camille, how you presented this to Parliament and to relate that anecdote as well?
Well, I recently, in getting out and talking to people about the guide, I was talking about it to members of the European Parliament. So that's the politicians, the political end of European government. And there was such enthusiasm for it. And I think one of the things that it did is it made the MEPs, the members of the Parliament, aware that they're using the services of their scientific advisory committee and the librarians and the subject matter experts that they use. But that's really invisible when they make pronouncements about things or when they stand up and speak in the House. And so there was a lot of excitement about realizing that they themselves had something they could do instead of just wringing their hands about public trust in information, that they had something that they could do to be clearer themselves about where they're getting information from and the people involved in that effort. We've spoken to people in the UK about this too, and one of the things that we've done is introduce members of the public to a question and answer with the House of Commons librarian. And the comment afterwards was, I didn't even realise that the politicians had a library. People were just so struck and pleased to find out that
good thing
politicians
they do, right?
go and try and source their information from somewhere. And so I think, it's exciting because it shows that it's not like everyone knows about this and they're dismissive. No one knows this is happening. So it shows where the work is.
Right, exactly. You just heard from Tracy Brown, the Director of Sense About Science, and Camille Gamboa, Associate Vice President of Corporate Communications at Sage. Join us next week when Louis Coiffé-Gunn, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, joins the discussion and we learn about his organization's mission, as well as the main obstacles that are hindering our ability to restore trust in science and scientific evidence. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Sage. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by Choice and produced by digital media producer Sabrina Kofer. Underwriting opportunities are directed by Melissa Carr and Ryan King. For more information, download the Choice Media Kit at choice360.org. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.